In September of 1958, Debbie Reynolds picked up the phone in her home in Los Angeles and called her best friend Elizabeth Taylor at the Essex House Hotel in New York. She wanted to check in. Elizabeth had lost her husband Mike Todd in a plane crash 5 months earlier, and Debbie's own husband, Eddie Fisher, had been in New York for days on business. A man answered the phone. It was Eddie. Debbie asked, calmly, if she could speak to Elizabeth. There was a pause. Then her best friend of 18 years came on the line and said coldly, "What do you want, Debbie?" That was how Debbie Reynolds found out. On the phone. From her own husband and her own best friend, in a hotel room they shouldn't have been sharing. She was 26 years old. She had a 2-year-old daughter named Carrie and a 7-month-old son named Todd, who had been named after Elizabeth's dead husband as a gift of friendship. She was, at that exact moment in 1958, one of the most beloved actresses in America, coming off Singin' in the Rain, the star of Tammy, the girl next door that every American mother wanted her son to marry. She was also, from that phone call forward, the most famous scorned wife in the country. Within days, it was in every newspaper in America. Eddie Fisher, the biggest pop singer in the country, was leaving Debbie Reynolds and their 2 babies for Elizabeth Taylor, the widow he had rushed to console after Mike Todd's plane went down. The public reaction was volcanic. Editorials called Taylor a homewrecker. Radio stations pulled Fisher's records. Elizabeth was denounced by the Vatican. Debbie was photographed with a diaper pin on her blouse and her hair in pigtails, holding baby Todd, and the picture went around the world as evidence of exactly what kind of woman the king of pop singers had walked out on. It was the biggest Hollywood scandal of the 1950s. It made Brad, Jen, and Angelina look mild half a century later. Debbie herself compared them to it. But the story didn't end where the tabloids left it. It didn't end with the divorce. It didn't end with Elizabeth marrying Eddie 6 months after Debbie's decree came through. It didn't end when Elizabeth left Eddie 4 years later for Richard Burton on the set of Cleopatra, or when Eddie's career collapsed and never recovered, or when Debbie went on to become an even bigger star than she had been before he left. The real story ended 40 years later, on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean, when 2 elderly women who had once been best friends and then bitter rivals found themselves alone in an elevator, and one of them slid a note under the other's door that night, and the friendship that Eddie Fisher had blown up came quietly, unexpectedly, back to life. This is the story of the affair that broke America's sweetheart, the man who ran from grief to grief, the best friend who took him, and the way a small, tough woman from El Paso, Texas, outlived them all. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was born Mary Frances Reynolds on April 1st, 1932, in El Paso, Texas. And for the first 7 years of her life, the family was so poor, they once lived in a cellar with a dirt floor. Her father, Raymond Reynolds, was a carpenter for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Her mother, Maxine, took in laundry when the railroad work slowed down. The Depression hit El Paso hard, and it hit the Reynolds family harder. Mary Frances shared a bed with her older brother Bill. There was no indoor plumbing for stretches. There was no money for anything that wasn't food, and often not enough for that either. She would remember, as an adult, wearing dresses her mother had sewn from flour sacks, and considering herself lucky because the sacks had flowers printed on them. The family was Nazarene, a strict evangelical Christian denomination that forbade drinking, dancing, movies, and most kinds of music. Mary Frances grew up in a house where entertainment was a sin. Her mother took her to church 3 times a week and told her, in plain language, that the theater was the devil's playground. Which is why, decades later, when Mary Frances would tell interviewers she had never wanted to be an actress as a child, she was telling the truth. What she had wanted to be was a gym teacher. She loved sports. She played hard. She joined the Girl Scouts as soon as she was old enough and would eventually earn 47 merit badges, one of the highest counts in the region. In 1939, when she was 7, the family finally saved enough for her father to move them west. Raymond had heard there was work in California for a good carpenter, and he built the family a small house on a piece of land in Burbank, in the San Fernando Valley. Mary Frances went from the Texas desert to Southern California in one long car ride, and Burbank became the town she would call home for the rest of her life. She was a tomboy at Burbank High School. She played the French horn in the marching band. She joined the Burbank Youth Symphony. She was, by every account of her classmates, ordinary, in the exact way that most future movie stars are not. She wasn't the prettiest girl in her class. She wasn't the most popular. She was small, energetic, sharp-tongued, and she could outrun and out-argue most of the boys. And then, in the spring of 1948, when she was 16 years old, she saw a poster in a store window. The city of Burbank was hosting a beauty pageant called Miss Burbank. The winner would get a small prize, but every contestant, whether they won or not, would receive a free silk blouse and a scarf. Mary Frances Reynolds did not care about the pageant. She cared about the blouse. She entered. She had nothing to wear for the swimsuit portion. Her mother patched up an old one from a closet. She had no heels. She borrowed them. For the talent portion, she had to do something, and the only thing she felt comfortable doing was an impression she'd been perfecting in front of the mirror since she was 12. She lip-synced a Betty Hutton song and did the whole comic routine that went with it, mugging and belting silently along, exactly the way Hutton did it on records. The audience laughed. She won. She had entered for a blouse. She walked out of that pageant with a title, a small trophy, and something she had not expected. 2 grown men in suits at the back of the auditorium, arguing over who got to sign her. They were talent scouts. One was from Warner Brothers, the other was from MGM. Both of them had come to the Miss Burbank pageant looking for exactly the kind of fresh, unspoiled American face the studios were hungry for after the war, and both of them had, independently, decided that this 16-year-old French horn player from Burbank High School was worth a contract. They couldn't agree. So, at the back of the auditorium, with Mary Frances still in her borrowed heels, they flipped a coin. Warner Brothers won. She went home that night to her Nazarene parents and told them what had happened. Her mother was horrified. The Reynolds family did not go to movies, and now their teenage daughter was being asked to be in them. Mary Frances, who had never wanted to be an actress a day in her life, sat with her father while he thought about it. Raymond Reynolds finally decided the money would pay for her college. She could try it for a while. If she hated it, she could quit and become a gym teacher. The Warner Brothers screen test happened a few days later. Mary Frances, who had never stood in front of a camera before, was told to look into the lens and ad-lib. She looked at the man giving her the instruction and said, "Why would I do that?" She was completely uninterested in performing for people she didn't know. The crew laughed. She got the contract. Jack Warner himself decided he did not like the name Mary Frances. He wanted something younger, cuter, more marketable. He picked Debbie out of nowhere and told the girl, in front of her parents, that her name was now Debbie Reynolds. She hated it. She was 16. She kept her mouth shut and signed the paper. The girl who had wanted to be a gym teacher was now, whether she liked it or not, going to be a movie actress. Warner Brothers put her in tiny bit parts. She played a bridesmaid in a Bette Davis picture. She played a girl at a pool. She was paid $60 a week, which was more money than her father made at the railroad, and she gave most of it to her mother. Then, in 1950, Warner Brothers stopped making musicals, and Debbie's contract was quietly dropped. She was 17. She thought her brief flirtation with Hollywood was over. She went to MGM to close out some final paperwork on a picture she'd done there on loan. Louis B. Mayer, the most powerful man in Hollywood, saw her walking through the MGM lot. He asked who she was. He was told. He signed her that afternoon. She had been in the movie business for 2 years. She had done almost nothing, and now the biggest studio in the world had her under contract, and Louis B. Mayer was, at that exact moment, looking for a 19-year-old girl to cast opposite Gene Kelly in a picture called Singin' in the Rain. The girl next door from Burbank was about to be handed the role of a lifetime. and it was going to nearly kill her. Gene Kelly did not want Debbie Reynolds. He was 39 years old in 1951, at the absolute peak of his creative power. He had just come off An American in Paris, which would win the Academy Award for Best Picture. He was co-directing his next film, Singin' in the Rain, with Stanley Donen. He was also its choreographer, its star, and effectively its producer. Everything about the picture went through him, and he had strong opinions about who his co-star should be. He wanted somebody trained. He wanted Sid Charisse, or Leslie Caron, or Vera Ellen. He wanted a professional dancer who could match him step for step. What MGM handed him instead was a 19-year-old girl from Burbank who had never taken a dance lesson in her life. Debbie Reynolds could tap a little. She had picked it up in high school. She could carry a tune. She was cute on camera, and the studio believed audiences would love her. What she could not do, at the level Gene Kelly demanded, was dance. Not the kind of dancing Singin' in the Rain required, which involved complex choreography, live musical numbers filmed in unbroken takes, and long routines opposite two of the greatest dancers of the 20th century, Kelly himself and Donald O'Connor. Kelly was furious about the casting. He did not hide it, and the way he handled his fury became one of the darkest making-of stories in the history of MGM musicals. He put her through hell. Debbie later said that making Singin' in the Rain and giving birth were the two hardest things she ever did in her life. She rehearsed dance routines for 8 to 14 hours a day, for months, in a studio at MGM, with Kelly standing over her, correcting every movement, criticizing every mistake, and rarely offering any praise. He was, in the plainest sense, a perfectionist, working with a beginner, and he had no patience for the gap between them. He told her she was terrible. He told her she wasn't a dancer. He mocked her in front of the crew. There is a story, which Debbie repeated for decades, and which her son Todd confirmed after her death, that she was crying under a piano on the MGM lot one day, after a particularly cruel rehearsal, and Fred Astaire happened to walk by, saw her, and asked what was wrong, she told him. Astaire, who was 52 years old and the most respected dancer in the world, took off his coat, sat down next to her, and told her that dancing was supposed to hurt, that if it didn't hurt, she wasn't doing it right, and that she needed to get up and get back to work. She did. The Good Morning number, the one where the three of them dance up and down a couch and through a whole house in one long, joyful sequence, is one of the most beloved routines in movie history. It looks effortless. It looks like three friends messing around. Behind the camera, it was 15 hours of continuous filming, from 8 in the morning until 11 at night, in a single day. When they finally called cut, Debbie had to be carried off the set. She had been dancing in tap shoes for so long, so hard, that her feet were bleeding inside them. When they pulled the shoes off, some of the skin came with them. She was 19 years old. None of that shows on screen. What shows on screen is a fresh-faced girl with a huge... Eddie Fisher had been famous longer than Debbie Reynolds had been in the movies. He was born Edwin Jack Fisher on August 10, 1928, in South Philadelphia, the fourth of 7 children in a poor Jewish immigrant family. His father, Joseph, was a Russian-born peddler who sold luggage door to door and later ran a small delicatessen. His mother, Kate, was from Ukraine. They had almost no money. Eddie grew up in a row house with his brothers and sisters piled on top of each other, hearing Yiddish at the dinner table and English on the street, and he was singing from before he could really read. His voice, when it came in, was extraordinary. A warm, rich, natural tenor with an easy vibrato and no strain at the top of his range. By the time he was 13, he was singing at bar mitzvahs and weddings around Philadelphia for tips. By 15, he was on local radio. At 17, he won a national talent contest and moved to New York, where he was scooped up almost immediately by the songwriter and bandleader Eddie Cantor, who put him on his radio show and, in effect, launched his career. By 1950, Eddie Fisher was a rising national name. By 1952, he was one of the biggest recording artists in America. He had 11 hit singles that year alone. His voice was on every jukebox in the country. He had his own television show, Coke Time with Eddie Fisher, sponsored by Coca-Cola, running 15 minutes twice a week on NBC, and it was one of the highest-rated musical programs in television. Teenage girls sent him thousands of letters a week. He toured to sold-out concert halls. He was, in the first half of the 1950s, essentially what Elvis Presley would become in the second half. He was America's boyfriend. He was also, though nobody who watched him on television would have guessed it, already a mess. Eddie Fisher's private life through his early 20s was chaotic, even by the standards of a young star with too much money and no real supervision. He had a first serious romance with Debbie's fellow MGM starlet, Pier Angeli, which fell apart when her mother forbade the marriage on religious grounds. He drank, he gambled, and by 1953, at 25, he had begun using a drug he had been prescribed by a New York doctor named Max Jacobson, a man who would later become notorious as Dr. Feelgood, the physician who injected John F. Kennedy and dozens of other celebrities with methamphetamine-laced vitamin cocktails. Eddie was one of Jacobson's earliest, most enthusiastic patients. He would be addicted to Jacobson's injections and eventually to harder drugs for the rest of his adult life. His singing voice, his marriages, his career, his sanity, all of it would eventually be eaten away by that addiction. But in 1955, at 27, he was still able to hide it. He looked healthy. He sang beautifully. He smiled at the cameras. He and Debbie Reynolds had been introduced by studio publicists at a New York event in 1954. They were the two hottest young stars in their respective fields, and MGM and RCA both had reasons for wanting them to be photographed together. There was nothing artificial about the attraction, at least on Debbie's side. She was 22, a raised Nazarene Burbank girl who had never had a serious boyfriend, and here was the handsomest crooner in America, telling her he wanted to marry her. She said yes. Her mother approved. The wedding took place on September 26, 1955, at Grossinger's, a famous Jewish resort in the Catskills, with hundreds of reporters and photographers held at the gates, and the ceremony broadcast on radio. She was 3 years old in the movie business. He was the biggest singer in the country. The tabloids called them America's favorite couple within a week, and for the next 3 years they lived up to it. Their daughter, Carrie Frances Fisher, was born on October 21, 1956, in Beverly Hills. She was named after her father's mother, Kate, and given Carrie as a variation. She would grow up, eventually, to be Princess Leia in Star Wars, one of the most famous women of her generation, and one of the sharpest writers in Hollywood. In 1956, she was a screaming, red-cheeked infant, and Eddie and Debbie were the wholesome young parents on the cover of every fan magazine in America. They bought a house in Beverly Hills. They bought a place at Grossinger's. They hosted dinners. They vacationed with other Hollywood couples, one couple in particular becoming their closest friends, and the two families were photographed together so often that the fan magazines started calling them the Power Quartet: Debbie and Eddie, Elizabeth and Mike. Elizabeth was Elizabeth Taylor, 24 years old in 1956, on her third husband. Mike was Mike Todd, a rough-edged, cigar-chomping Chicago film producer, brash and loud and 20 years older than she was. Todd had just produced Around the World in 80 Days, which would win the Academy Award for Best Picture that year. He was a genuine tycoon of the old Hollywood mold, a promoter, a gambler, and an extravagant lover. Elizabeth adored him. She had been through 2 miserable marriages already, first to hotel heir Nicky Hilton and then to actor Michael Wilding, and Mike Todd was the first man she felt had truly rescued her from all of it. Eddie Fisher worshipped Mike Todd. That is the word Eddie himself used later. Worshipped. Todd was everything Eddie wanted to be. He was rich, loud, powerful, the center of every room, the man everyone wanted to have dinner with. Eddie, whose success was still largely built on being a pretty tenor with a nice smile, saw in Mike Todd a version of masculinity he could aspire to. Todd, in turn, took a liking to Eddie. He treated him like a younger brother, He introduced him to important people. He gave him advice. Debbie and Elizabeth became close too. They had known each other for years at MGM, where they had briefly attended studio schooling together as teenagers. But the friendship deepened dramatically once the four of them started spending time together as couples. Debbie was Elizabeth's matron of honor when Elizabeth married Mike in Acapulco in February of 1957. Eddie was Mike's best man. They vacationed together, drove together, laughed together, and their kids played together. When Debbie had her second child, a son, in February of 1958, Eddie and Debbie made a decision that felt, at the time, like a beautiful tribute to their closest friendship. They named the baby Todd, after Mike. Elizabeth was told about the honor and was, by every account, deeply moved by it. 28 days later, on March 22, 1958, Mike Todd got on a private plane in Burbank, California, and headed for New York. He never got there. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The plane was called the Lucky Liz. Mike Todd had named it after his wife. It was a twin-engine Lockheed Lodestar, a small private aircraft he used for his constant coast-to-coast business travel. On the night of March 21, 1958, he was scheduled to fly from Burbank to New York, where he was to be honored the following day by the Friars Club as Showman of the Year. Elizabeth was supposed to go with him. She had been packed for days. Then she came down with a bad cold. Not just a sniffle, a high fever, a heavy chest, the kind of illness a doctor would tell you to stay in bed for. Mike, who was rarely tender about anything, was tender about this. He told her she wasn't going. He would not let her come on the plane in that condition. She begged him to cancel the whole trip, to skip the Friars Club dinner, to stay home with her. He wouldn't. He had promised the men of the Friars Club he would be there, and Mike Todd kept his promises. He kissed her goodbye. He kissed their 14-month-old daughter Liza. He got on the Lucky Liz just before midnight on March 21st, along with 3 other men, the pilot Bill Verner, the co-pilot Tom Barkley, and Todd's biographer Art Cohn, who was working on Todd's memoir and was catching a ride to New York to keep interviewing him. They took off from Burbank in a heavy overcast. The plane headed east into the southwest. Somewhere over New Mexico, sometime in the early morning hours of March 22nd, the Lucky Liz ran into trouble. The exact cause of what followed has been debated for decades. What is known is that the plane was carrying extra fuel tanks for the long trip east, that it was flying through a severe thunderstorm, and that it began to ice up at altitude. One of the engines failed. The pilot could not maintain altitude on the other one, weighted down as they were. The Lucky Liz went into the Zuni Mountains near Grants, New Mexico, at high speed. It burned on impact. There were no survivors. Mike Todd was 48 years old. The wreckage was found later that morning. His personal identification was recovered from the crash site, along with, gruesomely, his wedding ring. Elizabeth Taylor, 26 years old, was told the news at her Beverly Hills home by her mother-in-law, who had heard it on the radio. She screamed. That is the word every friend in the house that day used. She screamed and did not stop. Debbie Reynolds, hearing what had happened, drove straight over from her own home nearby. Elizabeth was inconsolable, in a way Debbie had never seen a person be. She was, in Debbie's later description, hysterical, thrashing, unable to walk on her own. Debbie helped put her to bed. She stayed for hours. She looked after Elizabeth's older children. Eddie Fisher, who was on tour, flew home immediately. Mike Todd had been his best friend, his mentor, the man he had wanted to be. Eddie's grief was real and enormous. He wept at the news. He barely spoke. And when he arrived back in Los Angeles and went to Elizabeth's house to see the widow, Debbie encouraged him. She thought it was important. Eddie had been closest to Mike. Elizabeth needed the people Mike had loved, and Eddie was one of them. Debbie handed her husband to her best friend that first week with her blessing. The funeral was held on March 25, 1958, at a small Jewish cemetery in Zurich, Illinois. Elizabeth was so distraught she had to be sedated. She screamed at the graveside. The public was locked out, kept back by police lines, but photographers captured her collapsing onto the coffin. Those pictures ran in every newspaper in America. The whole country grieved with her. She was, at that moment, the most sympathetic widow in the world. Eddie stayed close. He called her every day. He came over. He took her out to dinner because she couldn't bear to be alone. He made her laugh, when she could laugh at all. He sat with her while she cried, which was most of the time, and Debbie, back home with a 2-year-old daughter and a newborn son, thought her husband was doing the finest thing a man could do. She thought he was being loyal to his dead friend by taking care of the widow. She did not, at first, hear the whispers. The whispers started within weeks. Hollywood is a small town, and Eddie Fisher was a famous man, and famous men who spend hour after hour alone with beautiful widows do not go unnoticed. By late spring of 1958, the columnists in New York and Los Angeles were beginning to wonder, in careful language, exactly how much time Eddie was spending consoling Elizabeth Taylor. Then the carefully worded questions became items. Then the items became photographs. Eddie and Elizabeth were seen at a nightclub, then at a Broadway show, then in the Catskills, then in New York, at the Essex House Hotel, where Eddie was maintaining a suite, and where Elizabeth was, oddly, also staying. Debbie, in Los Angeles with the 2 babies, kept telling herself it was nothing. Eddie had a business reason to be in New York. Elizabeth was a widow who needed her friends. She had known Elizabeth for years. Elizabeth was her friend, her matron of honor at her wedding, the woman for whom her son had been named. Debbie could not imagine, and did not want to imagine, that either of them would do what everyone around her was hinting they were doing. And then, in September of 1958, she picked up the phone and called the Essex house. A man answered the phone in Elizabeth's suite. It was Eddie. There was a long pause. Debbie kept her voice steady. She asked if she could please speak to Elizabeth. There was another pause. Then her best friend of 18 years came on the line and said, coldly, "What do you want, Debbie?" Debbie hung up. She sat with the receiver in her lap in her house in Beverly Hills. She was 26 years old. Her son was 7 months old. Her daughter Carrie was almost 2. Her husband was in a hotel room in New York with her best friend, and she understood, in the clarity of that moment, that everything the columnists had been hinting at was true, that her husband had left her, that Elizabeth Taylor had taken him, that the marriage was over. She did not scream. She did not cry, not at first. She was, above all else, a small, tough girl from El Paso who had been raised by a Nazarene mother and had grown up sleeping in a bed with her brother, in a house with no plumbing, and she had a long, deep, Texas-born practicality that carried her through the worst moments of her life. She picked up the phone and called her mother. Then she called her lawyer. Within days, it was in every newspaper in America. The scandal was about to become the biggest Hollywood story of the decade. The story broke on September 12, 1958, when the columnist Hedda Hopper reached Elizabeth Taylor on the phone in New York and asked her, directly, if she was involved with Eddie Fisher. Elizabeth, 26 years old and grief-stricken and stubborn, did not deny it. She admitted the affair. She said she was in love with Eddie. And then, according to Hopper, she said something that would follow her around for years. "What do you expect me to do? Sleep alone?" Hopper printed the whole conversation the next day, every syllable of it, and America went into a rage the likes of which Hollywood had rarely seen. The reaction was volcanic, and it was one-sided. Elizabeth Taylor, who 3 months earlier had been the most sympathetic widow in the country, was suddenly the most hated woman in America. Newspapers called her a home wrecker, a husband stealer, a Jezebel. Editorials thundered from the Bible Belt. The Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, denounced her by name. Radio stations pulled Eddie Fisher's records off the air. His concert bookings started getting cancelled. Eddie Cantor, the man who had discovered him and put him on national radio a decade earlier, publicly disowned him. His television show, Coke Time, was axed. And Debbie Reynolds became, overnight, the most photographed victim in America. She played it perfectly. Whether by instinct or design, and probably some combination of the two, Debbie understood exactly what the public wanted from her, and she gave it to them. She appeared at her front door in Beverly Hills for the waiting reporters wearing a plain house dress. Her hair was in pigtails, a look that made her seem younger than her 26 years. She was holding baby Todd on her hip. She had a diaper pin visibly clipped to the front of her blouse. Whether she had put it there for effect has been argued for decades. Whatever the truth, the image went around the world within 24 hours. Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart, in pigtails and a diaper pin, holding the son she had named after Mike Todd. The message the photograph made was devastating. This was the woman Eddie Fisher had walked out on. This was the woman Elizabeth Taylor had taken him from. Debbie later said, dryly, that she wasn't fool enough to think the public would forgive Elizabeth just because Elizabeth was beautiful. She said she knew the public was going to take her side, and she made sure they did. She did not, at any point in the initial press coverage, publicly attack Elizabeth. She spoke to reporters with quiet dignity. She said she had loved Elizabeth for many years. She said she was heartbroken. She said she did not know what she had done to deserve this. Every word she chose was, in effect, an unspoken accusation, and it landed like an anvil. Elizabeth did not fight back publicly, but she did not apologize either. She and Eddie moved through the fall of 1958, doing exactly what the tabloids expected them to do, attending parties in New York, being photographed at nightclubs, refusing to hide. Elizabeth, in particular, seemed almost defiant. She had lost her husband, the great love of her life. She had grieved, and now she had found, in Eddie, some kind of comfort, and she was not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of the public. Behind that public defiance, according to people who knew her, she was in worse shape than the columns admitted. She was drinking heavily. She was taking pills to sleep. She was, in the plainest possible terms, replacing Mike Todd with Eddie Fisher because she could not, physically or emotionally, be alone in a room. Debbie, decades later, would say something remarkably generous about this. She said Elizabeth had needed a replacement for Mike Todd, and Eddie was what she had. She said Elizabeth had not gone out looking to destroy her. She had just needed something desperately, in the darkest year of her life, and Eddie had been the thing available. Eddie, meanwhile, was in a different kind of collapse. He had walked away from a marriage he had promised, a wife America loved, 2 babies, and the wholesome public image that had made him a millionaire. He was addicted to Dr. Feelgood's injections and getting worse. His voice was already starting to fray under the drugs, and he was making a decision that would, over the next few years, destroy his career entirely. The divorce moved quickly. Debbie filed in October of 1958. Eddie did not contest it. On February 19, 1959, the divorce was granted. Debbie was awarded custody of both children. Eddie kept an obligation of child support that he would, in later years, largely fail to pay. On May 12, 1959, less than 3 months after the divorce was final, Eddie Fisher married Elizabeth Taylor at a synagogue in Las Vegas. Eddie had converted to Judaism for her, which added another layer of scandal for a certain slice of the American press. Elizabeth wore a green cocktail dress. She was 30. She was on husband number 4. Debbie watched the news of the wedding from her house in Los Angeles, alone with her 2 children, and she went back to work. She had, in a real sense, no choice. Eddie's finances were a wreck. Debbie needed the money, and she also, in her Texas tough way, was determined not to let the scandal define her. She went back to MGM. She made pictures. She made records. She made television specials. She toured. She got up every morning and worked. And she raised Carrie and Todd. And she stayed publicly gracious about the whole thing in a way that only made the public love her more. Her career did not collapse. That was what she was afraid of. That was what the tabloids had all predicted, that America's sweetheart would be forever tainted by the divorce, that audiences would turn on her, that MGM would drop her. None of it happened. The public loved her more, not less. Her next several pictures were hits. In 1964, 6 years after Eddie left her, she starred in The Unsinkable Molly Brown, playing a Colorado silver mining wife who survives the Titanic, and she earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. She was, at that moment, at the peak of her career. She had become bigger than she had been before the scandal. Eddie's career, by contrast, was in the process of ending. His records stopped selling, his television show was gone, his nightclub bookings dried up. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was climbing to the biggest role of her life. In 1960, 20th Century Fox cast her as Cleopatra, in the most expensive production in movie history to that point. Elizabeth was paid a record-breaking $1 million for the role, the first actress ever to command that fee. She flew to Rome. Eddie went with her, functioning essentially as her assistant, her walker, her drug companion. He hovered in the background. He arranged her medications. He was, in the words of everyone who saw them together on the Cleopatra set, no longer really her husband. He was her staff. And then, in the summer of 1961, Elizabeth Taylor met her Mark Antony. His name was Richard Burton. He was a Welsh actor with a voice like a cathedral organ, a hard drinker, married with children, and one of the great classical stage performers of his generation. He and Elizabeth started an affair on the Cleopatra set within weeks. It was passionate, public, drunken, and impossible to hide. By the winter of 1961, everyone in Rome knew. By 1962, it was in every paper in the world, a scandal that would eclipse even the one Elizabeth had generated 4 years earlier. Eddie Fisher, the man Elizabeth had taken from Debbie Reynolds, was now being taken from himself. The universe, if you were the sort of person who believed in that kind of accounting, was tallying its books. Eddie Fisher found out about Richard Burton the way Debbie Reynolds had found out about him 4 years earlier, not from his wife, from other people. He was in Rome with Elizabeth for the Cleopatra shoot. He was, by the spring of 1962, essentially a fixture on the set, hanging around in Elizabeth's dressing room, arranging her pills, dealing with her hairdressers and her studio car. His own career had almost stopped. He had not had a hit record in years. His voice, ravaged by the amphetamines Dr. Feelgood was still injecting him with, was no longer reliably his own. He was 33 years old and living in his wife's shadow, and the shadow was about to grow much larger. Elizabeth and Richard Burton had begun their affair almost immediately after starting to shoot together. Burton was a serious actor from the Welsh mining valleys, a Shakespearean stage star with a voice that made Eddie Fisher's tenor sound like a boy soprano. He was also married to a woman named Sybil, and he had 2 young daughters. None of that stopped him. Elizabeth, for her part, was ready to leave Eddie the moment she met somebody more interesting, which turned out to be almost immediately. By the end of the Cleopatra shoot in the summer of 1962, the affair was public. The tabloids were in Rome by the plane load, and the Vatican, which had denounced Elizabeth for taking Eddie from Debbie, denounced her again for now taking Burton from Sybil. The second denunciation used harsher language than the first. Eddie tried, briefly, to fight it. He flew home to New York and called a press conference in March of 1962, in which he insisted his marriage to Elizabeth was fine and denied any affair. Elizabeth undermined him from Rome within hours, refusing to back up his statement. Eddie fell apart on camera. It was one of the most humiliating moments of his life. He was, in that moment, the man Elizabeth Taylor had chosen 4 years ago in front of the entire world, being publicly cast off, 4 years later, in front of the same audience. The divorce dragged on until March of 1964. Elizabeth and Burton married 9 days after her decree came through. Eddie's descent, from that point forward, was not slow. It was steep. He remarried twice more, to the actress Connie Stevens in 1967, and to a Chinese-American businesswoman named Terry Richard in 1975, and both marriages ended in divorce. He lost most of his money to bad management, drug bills, and a gambling habit he had never quite controlled. He filed for bankruptcy in the 1970s. He continued using amphetamines. His voice, once the finest natural tenor in American popular music, was gone by his mid-40s. He toured smaller and smaller clubs. He wrote 2 memoirs, both bitter, both full of sexual boasting, both largely ignored. He died in 2010, at 82, of complications from hip surgery, in a small house in Berkeley, California, mostly forgotten. Debbie Reynolds outlived him by 6 years. She lived and she worked. That was the pattern of her entire life after 1958. She kept working. She married again in 1960, less than a year after the Fisher divorce, to a wealthy shoe store magnate named Harry Carl. That marriage was, in a different way, a disaster. Carl turned out to be a compulsive gambler who lost her entire fortune, including the money she had earned from the unsinkable Molly Brown and everything else through the 1960s. When Debbie divorced him in 1973, she found she was $3 million in debt. She was 41 years old, twice divorced, and broke. She rebuilt. She took her nightclub act on the road. She played Las Vegas. She played Reno. She played every second-tier venue in America that would book her, and she worked constantly. In 1973, she went to Broadway to star in a revival of Irene, which earned her a Tony nomination. She toured on stage for the rest of her life. She saved every dollar she could, and eventually opened a Las Vegas hotel and casino she called the Debbie Reynolds Hollywood Hotel, which she ran for years as a showcase for her enormous personal collection of Hollywood memorabilia. She had spent decades quietly buying up costumes and props from old MGM auctions, saving pieces that would otherwise have been thrown out, and she had assembled one of the greatest private collections of Hollywood artifacts in existence.
The hotel went bankrupt in 1997.
She lost most of the money again and had to auction off pieces of the collection over the following years, but she kept a huge amount of it, and it remains one of the most important surviving records of American cinema history. She married a 3rd time, in 1984, to a real estate developer named Richard Hamlet. He also drained her finances. She divorced him in 1996. She never married again. None of that broke her. She had absorbed the worst public humiliation of the 1950s and come out of it with her career intact and her sense of humor intact, and by the time she reached her 70s, she was, if anything, more beloved than she had ever been. She showed up on Will and Grace as Grace's difficult mother and stole every scene. She toured with a one-woman show that packed theaters. She was, in the last quarter of her life, one of the great grand dame survivors of Hollywood's golden age, and the public treated her accordingly. Her daughter Carrie was, of course, Princess Leia. Carrie Fisher had grown up in the shadow of the Fisher-Taylor-Reynolds scandal and had turned it into material. She wrote about it in her novels, in her one-woman shows, in her essays, with a wit so sharp and honest that she became one of the finest writers of her generation. Debbie and Carrie's relationship, famously fraught in the 1970s and 1980s, healed into one of the closest mother-daughter friendships in Hollywood. They lived next door to each other for the last 2 decades of their lives, in twin houses in Beverly Hills connected by a shared garden. They saw each other every day. And then, in 1997, 39 years after the phone call, Debbie Reynolds walked into an elevator on a cruise ship and came face to face with Elizabeth Taylor. Neither of them had planned it. Both of them had been booked separately on the same voyage, a fundraising cruise for AIDS research, one of Elizabeth's causes. Elizabeth had been an AIDS activist for a decade by then, since her friend Rock Hudson's death in 1985. Debbie had come because she supported the cause and because she never turned down a chance to perform for money. Neither of them had known the other would be there. They stood in the elevator and looked at each other. They had not spoken in decades. Debbie broke the silence first. That was in her nature. She was still, at 65, the small, tough girl from El Paso who did not walk away from difficult conversations. She said hello. Elizabeth, 65 herself, and slower now, and heavier, and dealing with the health problems that would trouble her for the rest of her life, said hello back. They talked for a few minutes. Nothing enormous was said. It was small talk, a little stiff, the way any conversation would be between 2 women who had once been best friends and had then, for 4 decades, been the 2 most famous rivals in Hollywood. The elevator arrived at their floor. They got off. They went to their separate suites. That night, alone in her cabin, Debbie thought about it. And then she did something that took either courage or stubbornness or both. She got out a piece of paper and a pen and wrote Elizabeth a note. What exactly it said has never been publicly disclosed, but the gist of it, according to what both women later told friends, was that too much time had passed, that whatever had happened, that Mike and Eddie were long gone as issues between them, that they were two old women now who had loved each other once and had lost each other over a man who was not worth either of them. Debbie walked down the corridor and slipped the note under Elizabeth's door. The next morning, Elizabeth called her. They had breakfast. And by the end of that cruise, the friendship that Eddie Fisher had blown up in 1958 was, for the first time in 39 years, quietly back. They saw each other after that, not constantly. Both of them were busy. Both of them were in decline in different ways, but they were friends again. Debbie later said, characteristically dry, that they had never quite gotten back to what they had been at 22 and 24, but they had gotten back enough. Enough for phone calls, enough for lunches, enough that when Elizabeth Taylor died in March of 2011, at 79, Debbie was among the friends who mourned her genuinely, and not for the cameras. Eddie had died a few months earlier, in September of 2010. Debbie was asked by reporters if she had anything to say. She said, quietly, that she wished him peace. That was all. She did not attend the funeral. She had, in a real sense, finished with Eddie Fisher decades earlier. Then came December of 2016, and the ending nobody was prepared for. Debbie's daughter Carrie was flying back from London, where she had been promoting the newest Star Wars film. On December 23rd, on the flight, she went into cardiac arrest. She was rushed to a hospital in Los Angeles. She was on a ventilator for 4 days. She died on December 27, 2016. She was 60 years old. Debbie, 84, was at her son Todd's house in Beverly Hills, planning the funeral, when she suffered a stroke the next day. She was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She did not recover. She died on December 28, 2016, 1 day after her daughter. Her son Todd told reporters that his mother, in the hours before her stroke, had told him she wanted to be with Carrie. It is the kind of line that would sound theatrical from anybody else. From Debbie Reynolds, who had raised Carrie mostly on her own after Eddie left, who had lived next door to her for the last 2 decades of their lives, who had walked through the worst public humiliation of the 1950s while carrying a 7-month-old baby named Todd on her hip. It sounded exactly right. Mother and daughter were buried together at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles, in a joint service on January 5, 2017. Their ashes are interred in the same crypt. Look at the whole shape of it. A dirt floor cellar in El Paso, a Nazarene mother who thought movies were sinful, a coin toss at a beauty pageant, a bleeding pair of feet dancing next to Gene Kelly, a wedding at a Jewish resort, a best friend at the altar as her matron of honor, a baby named Todd, a plane crash in New Mexico, a phone call to a hotel in New York, a husband gone, a public humiliation nobody expected her to survive, a career that only grew larger, 3 broken marriages, a daughter who became Princess Leia, an elevator on a cruise ship, and a note slipped under a door, and 39 years erased in a single morning. Eddie Fisher died broken and mostly forgotten. Elizabeth Taylor died surrounded by the friends who had come back to her over the years, including Debbie. Debbie died holding on to her daughter, 1 day behind her, refusing even in death to let Carrie go on alone. The girl who wanted to be a gym teacher outlasted them all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.